Good afternoon. I'm Suzanne Borden, Moment Magazine's Zoominar producer, and I'd like to welcome you to today's program, What to Do About Anti-Semitism and Racism with Eric K. Ward. Joining Eric is Moment's editor-in-chief, Nadine Epstein. Today is the second program in a series of conversations on anti-Semitism taking place throughout the year, hosted by Moment Magazine with the support of the Joyce and Irving Goldman Family Foundation. Today's session is being recorded. Please type your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible at the end of the session. Following the program, please visit Moment's website, where you can sign up to receive Moment's Anti-Semitism Monitor. You will also find a variety of articles on the topic of anti-Semitism, as well as on racism. Be sure to register for next week's Zoominar, North Africa's Forgotten Holocaust, in commemoration of International Holocaust Remembrance Day, and co-sponsored by the American Sephardi Federation. Now for today's program. Eric K. Ward is a nationally recognized expert on the relationship between authoritarian movements, hate violence, and preserving inclusive democracy. Eric brings over 30 years of leadership in community organizing and philanthropy to his role as the Western States Center's executive director and a senior fellow with the Southern Poverty Law Center and Race Forward, as well as co-chair for the Proteus Fund. Since Eric took the helm in 2017, Western States Center has become a national hub for innovative responses to white nationalism, anti-Semitism, and structural inequality. Eric is the author of multiple written works credited with key narrative shifts, including Skin in the Game, How Anti-Semitism Animates White Nationalism, and he's been quoted in many media outlets like the New York Times, ESPN, NPR, and Rolling Stone. He is the recipient of the Peabody Facebook Futures Media Award. Eric is currently working on a forthcoming documentary about whiteness and race in America. Please welcome Eric Ward and Moment's editor-in-chief, Nadine Epstein.
Hi, Eric.
Nadine, it's so great to see you.
It's wonderful to see you too. And here we are between Martin Luther King's birthday and the inauguration, a big day here. And I thought maybe we'll start with Martin Luther King. So you were a toddler, maybe. I think you told me you were 2 years old when Martin Luther King was assassinated. And so I was wondering how his life and how his death inspired your life journey.
Yeah, it's so interesting because it was such a generational divide that had a lot to do with culture and you know, not my family, not time. It was the divide between black and white television and the colorization of television, right? And for someone my age, without it being taught, you know, things in black and white were like ancient history, even though it was technically like a few years, right, earlier. And everything that was colorized were things that were happening now. So for my generation growing up, for many of us, Martin Luther King was an image that was a photo or a print that was on the walls of our parents or our grandparents, usually next to John F. Kennedy or Abraham Lincoln, right? And that's kind of what I understood of Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement. There was no Martin Luther King Jr. Day, right? Mm-hmm. That didn't come for decades, right? And so for many of us, our understanding of Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement was kind of this distant memory, this thing that kind of happened at one point, and everyone lived happily ever after as we understood it. We didn't understand the connection between the systemic racism, Nadine, that people were facing, right, that we were facing as children, right, and the civil rights struggle. It didn't really come until much later, you know, when I was in college, right, when I was exposed to the idea of bigotry as something more than just a set of behaviors, right, that it actually, racism and anti-Semitism and other forms of bigotry weren't just the individual actions of individuals, there were systems, there was ideology at times, that I came to really understand the power and significance of Martin Luther King, of the nonviolent movement, of the civil rights movement. It really was this incredible, powerful moment in our country that was so significant. And I still think to this day, we don't really understand the power and the influence of that movement and the reaction to it. Though, as you know, Nadine, from the work of Moment and its amazing coverage online and in its magazine of these issues, we watched the culmination of the reaction to the 1960 civil rights movement on January 6th in Washington, D.C., as people stormed the Capitol building.
Well, we're going to get to that in 1 second.
Yes.
So you brought me right where I wanted to be.
Oh, perfect.
So I spent a little time reading some of your work in the last few days, and I noticed you wrote something I thought, anti-Semitism is the paper upon which racial nationalism is written. It's also the template for poisoning populist moments. And then you wrote a few lines later, this is in a piece on Medium, just as much of America has been waking up to the stake we all have in dismantling anti-Black racism, so too must we realize that a truly inclusive American democracy requires that every community understand and fully disavow anti-Semitism, whether on the left or the right. So I was wondering what you were thinking as you watched the insurrection of white nationalists on the Capitol unfold on January 6th, and saw Confederate flags and saw men wearing T-shirts that, you know, like Camp Auschwitz.
Yes. Yes. It was a hard day. I think, look, I have been organizing with communities and leaders around the country for decades to try to help elected officials, to try to help social movements understand that there is this social movement grounded in exclusion in our society, and that that social movement that we call the white nationalist movement, right, or its larger coalition, the alt-right, is steeped in anti-Semitism. And I'm often asked, where is that anti-Semitism, right? Where is that elephant in the room? And it's hard to actually point out unless you have an understanding of anti-Semitism. If you have some grounding in what anti-Semitism looks like, it's everywhere, right? It's in the language of individuals who were wearing Camp Auschwitz, right? It's in the language of QAnon, right? It is in the idea of a global elite, right, who have somehow taken over, right, the United States and are attempting to destroy white Christians. This narrative of anti-Semitism is really powerful. And for myself, for a person who's not Jewish, right, I'm a Black racial justice activist. It became really apparent to me in the 80s. And I had moved up to the Pacific Northwest. I was attending the University of Oregon, and I, just like many people today, was asked by individuals who were concerned about hate groups. And my response initially was, who cares about these hate groups, right? More Black people die from our healthcare system in terms of infant mortality, right? And within prison systems. And, you know, I would unwind the list, and I would say to folks, which I think was a fair question, why is this white nationalist movement, why should it even have any of our time, right? And what I soon began to understand with the help of others and through reading is that that social movement has the same impact in society as any other social movement can. And if we think somehow just because social movements are grounded in exclusion, that they have no influence on our society, it's really a practice of arrogance on our part. We would never say that about the civil rights movement. We would never say that about other, social movements for equality, such as the women's movement, we would acknowledge that social movements have influence. In the same way, Nadine, so too does this white nationalist movement. And it has its birth, as I said before, in the reaction to the victories of the civil rights movement. The white nationalist movement was the answer to how it could lose to people it saw as fundamentally inferior, Black people, right? In the minds of those who believed in segregation based off of race, there was simply no way that they could lose their greatest political defeat, right? Or have their greatest political defeat to folks who were inferior. So they had to come up with another answer. It was here in the Pacific Northwest that that answer became very visible, right? As we were doing work against hate crimes and hate groups here in the Pacific Northwest, this was pre-internet, right? So I always have to kind of flag that. There was a time when there was no internet. And so the way that hate groups promulgated their ideas was through flyers, right? They would flyer whole neighborhoods, they would mail flyers. And the thing about flyers were it was kind of like an early advance notice, an early warning. You knew when a community got littered with flyers that there was probably organizing and that there would be hate violence that followed. But here's the interesting thing, Nadine, about those flyers. Those flyers were vile. I mean, they were anti-Black, they were anti-Latino, they were homophobic, they were transphobic, right? Hatred towards Muslims, hatred towards women, you name it. And these flyers contained it in the most vile imagery.
Yes.
But there was something that I noticed on all of the flyers, nearly all of them, no matter what community they were targeting, there was always something like a Jewish symbol or an anti-Semitic caricature, right, of a Jewish person on these flyers. People of color were always like positioned as kind of like puppets, right, on the strings of kind of these Jewish caricatures. And that's when I realized that I needed to understand anti-Semitism, that these groups were focused on Jews so much that I needed to understand why. And that's how I began to have conversations around anti-Semitism.
Well, those flyers still exist. In 2016, right after when the campaign was gearing up, and then right after the election, there were flyers in my neighborhood in Washington, D.C. that were all distributed outside on the sidewalks. And they had all sorts of again, as you point out, all these different kinds of symbolisms were there, but certainly the anti-Semitic symbolism was there.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Look, I just saw recently today an opinion piece that, I read today an opinion piece that recently appeared in the Wall Street Journal, right? Kind of critiquing, it was basically critiquing a left takeover of the civil rights movement. Not the case. Look, the left in America represents like 6% of the American population, right? It's a very small number of folks. They have as much influence over civil rights as any other grouping can, but never let facts get in the way of a story, right? And so what was interesting though is some of the language in that essay, right? Talking about the influence of Hollywood, right? The influence of communists. These were all old kind of tropes, dog whistles used against Jews in the 20s and 30s.
Yeah, and in the 50s.
And in the 50s again.
Particularly, yeah.
And the 80s.
In the 80s.
That's right.
So, so one of the things that's so interesting about you that you actually go out and talk about how basically it's so important to combat anti-Semitism in order to combat what you call anti-Black racism. And you can also tell us why you use that term anti-Black racism, which is a term that I think is unique to you.
Yeah. So, we talk about anti-Black racism because the construction of race in America, right? So, I always have to say race is a false construction, right? There's no biological definition of race. In short, race may not exist, but racism very much exists. And, none of us were here, so none of us are responsible for the origins of racism. In fact, it predates the United States. but it is, right, upon which the structure upon which American society and the United States was established. This idea that white people were superior based off of their skin color and that people of color were inferior. But at the end of that false binary was white and black, right? So that's often why we talk about anti-blackness and in the nature of race in America, because the faces at the bottom of the well were black people, though I think it is also fair and honest to name that indigenous populations also, right, were there. And so we often talk about the construction of white supremacy, this idea of subjugation of people of color because they are seen as biologically inferior, being written on the paper of anti-blackness. But white nationalism, which I distinguish from Nadine, I would argue is written upon the paper of anti-Semitism. And our inability to understand anti-Semitism has left us vulnerable, right, to this white nationalist movement, this alt-right coalition that was involved in this attempted insurrection. And I would go further to say, right, that our unwillingness at times to really wrestle and grapple with anti-Semitism means that we are partly also responsible for what has transpired over these last 4 years.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's go for a moment to the left and right, because there's obviously different kinds of anti-Semitism out there.
Yes.
And so what can we do to fight anti-Semitism on the right? And we're going to get to the left, I promise.
Yeah. So, you know, I think this is really good to get into. So I won't get into the left. We'll come to that in a second. But I will say, if we start the conversation helping folks understand for a second, there are, I'm going to say this really is going to be very provocative. So I'm just going to say it. There is no left or right anti-Semitism. So now I'm just going to say that very provocative thing and just throw it out there. And I'll say it again. Eric Ward is saying there is no left or right anti-Semitism. Now, if you forgive me for a second, if everyone takes a deep breath, because I know everyone just position themselves, I'm going to offer a little bit of nuance to that. And what I mean by that, if you'll give me permission, is what I'm saying is that anti-Semitism itself doesn't originate on the left or right. It is just in our society for lots of different reasons. One is that anti-Semitism, right, besides sexism, is one of the oldest forms of bigotry in the world. We are well conditioned, all of us, right, non-Jews and Jews, right, to the unconscious bias that is anti-Semitism in our society. And so what I often say, to come back, is there's no left or right anti-Semitism. There is merely anti-Semitism in society, and then how political movements or entities at time tap into that anti-Semitism to organize it, right? And on the right, the way that anti-Semitism has been organized is this. So you suffer a huge political defeat to folks you see as inferior. You're never going to admit that you lost to them, but you got to come up with a reason that it happened. Just like when I fail a test, right? I never failed a test, but well, okay, maybe a few times in college I may have stayed out too late. But those times, those rare times when I might have failed a test, I immediately asked myself, how did that happen, right? And in the same way, white nationalists, those who had lost, asked the same question. How did that happen? Well, the most clearest, honest answer was never going to be the answer they picked. So they borrowed, right, from the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, a very powerful anti-Semitic false narrative that purports to tell the story of Jewish elders who gather, right, in a cemetery at midnight to plot the takeover of European Christendom, right, and the destruction of European Christians through taking control of the financial systems of art and culture, of politics, right? And so that narrative gets promulgated here in the US very successfully by a wealthy industrialist by the name of Henry Ford, who manufactured and mass produced the automobile. Henry Ford was a huge pacifist, right? But what isn't often discussed is that he was a huge pacifist because he believed and often talked of Jews, right, starting and controlling wars. He was an anti-Semite. He came across the protocols. He was so enamored with them that he republished them under a series of essays called The International Jew, which ran in his newspapers, which were distributed through Ford dealerships around the country, right? He made his Ford dealership sell this newspaper, exposing hundreds of thousands of Americans to this idea. It is the idea that segregationists returned to, right, under the demise of Jim Crow by the civil rights movement. And it provided an easy answer. For them, it allowed them to keep in mind the belief that Black people were inferior. And instead they could blame it on the secret cabal, right, of Jewish political elites. And since that time, Jews have been placed as the insidious other, right, around the expansion of democracy and human rights in the United States. That's how anti-Semitism works on the right. They see Jews as a biological other, a whole nother race endowed with supernatural powers, right, in order to wipe out the white race. That is modern anti-Semitism in America.
And it's always different in different, whoever's the leader of the white nationalist movement, whether it's the Posse Comitatus or whether it's the groups that I actually used to cover in the late 1980s on the US-Arizona border, the vigilante groups, or whether it's David Duke, who we write about, they're
That's
all
right.
basically using the same philosophy, these same ideas that we see now in QAnon and we see in the Proud Boys. It's really
That's right. And I know I'm not up here to run ads for a moment. You all do a wonderful job, but I will say to those who are listening, right, Moment did probably one of the seminal studies on QAnon and anti-Semitism, right? The essay, The Question of Q, right? And I'm forgetting who the writer was of that piece, but I would really encourage folks to take a look. If you understand the basic outline of the protocols of the learned elders of Zion, and you look at the basic outline and the argument of QAnon, right? This conspiracy that has led to deaths, right? Has led to attacks. We just had an incident here over the weekend where an adherent of QAnon fired into the federal building in downtown Portland, Oregon, right? QAnon is the modern manifestation of the protocols of the learned elders of Zion. It's just wrapped in 2020 costume.
We have Sarah Posner's written about this for us several
times
now. And also we have an interview that we did that's an interview that you can watch, which is Amy Schwartz, who is our opinion editor, interviewing her about QAnon right after the January 6th. So it's very, very relevant.
Very relevant.
So let's talk a little bit about the left. So I noticed that, so you're part of this, you run this group called the Western State Center, which does really wonderful work. And one of the things, you happen to have this project where you help train leaders on the left or progressive movements to recognize and combat anti-Semitism. And because as you point out, I don't think we all realize, or people realize always, they're aware of what the anti-Semitic tropes are. And I was wondering, so what do we do? That's something that you're doing, and you could tell us a little bit about it, but what do we do in general about people from the left who use these tropes of anti-Semitism?
Yes.
And yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead, Nadine.
So, no, go, you answer, and I have some, go ahead.
So I'll give a basic piece and then we can dive into this. So if anti-Semitism exists in society, right, it means it exists across the political spectrum, which means if we can just dispense, right, with the debate, that means anti-Semitism also exists on the left, right, in that way. And the question then becomes, how is it tapped into, right, and how is it seen? And anti-Semitism on the left, doesn't consciously place Jews as a nefarious other. It's much more unconscious, right? But whether I accidentally or purposely step on your foot, it still hurts when I step on your foot. And in the same way, while the conscious anti-Semitism in the white nationalist movement is much more dangerous, I don't want to even parse words around that, right? The ADL did a pretty comprehensive study in 2019 of anti-Semitic incidences. And in that report they published in 2019, they were able to identify, tie almost 10% of those acts to extremists. And every single one of them, right, was a white nationalist or alt-right, right? So that tells you about the significance of anti-Semitism on the right as an organizing narrative. Now, on the left, it appears in different spaces upon the left. And for me, what I find problematic about it is the most dangerous anti-Semitism on the left is the anti-Semitism of denial, right? The argument that anti-Semitism doesn't exist on the left, and if it does exist on the left, it isn't relevant and it isn't worth contending with. But my argument, counter-argument to that piece is this. It is our unwillingness to address anti-Semitism that left our communities vulnerable to this white nationalist movement, right? I'm not saying we could have stopped or contended with this white nationalist movement on our own. What I'm saying is we weren't able to properly prepare our communities because of our stubbornness around anti-Semitism. Now, where does that stubbornness arise from? Well, I think it arises around confusion, around what I call the three antis, as given to me by a good friend, right? Anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, right? Anti-Israel. And because folks don't understand the different parameters, and because unconscious anti-Semitism exists, we often find ourselves stumbling through anti-Semitism. I'll give a counterpoint. If you don't have a good understanding of racism and you start talking about crime in the Black community, I can guarantee, I can set the clock, and I can guarantee you within 10 minutes, you are likely to say something offensively racist. It's not your fault, except in the fact that you haven't done your homework on race in America that allows you to avoid those minefields. Well, in the same way, I think that is one point where we see anti-Semitism arise on the left, particularly around what is now known as the third rail of left politics, which is Israel and the Palestinian territories, right? National sovereignty, right? And conflict in the Middle East. But there's another area where it raises as well, Nadine, and I think it's worth talking about. And this is the idea of whiteness, right? And the idea that whiteness is the static definition that has never changed. Well, guess what? Race in America has redefined itself many times in our hundreds of years, our 200-year history, right? There is a time where if you were Swedish in America, you weren't white. And I guarantee you, right, before September 11th, 2001, if you were light-skinned and Arab in America, you were considered white. But I guarantee you on September 12th, right, you were no longer considered white in America. So race is a fluid definition. And most recently, Nadine, since about the 1950s or 60s, right, largely Jews, right, are considered white as in the extent that they are not seen as Jewish, right? So I'll say that again. Jews have been allowed to have some access to whiteness and its privileges to the extent that they are not seen, right, as Jewish, right? And if you don't believe that, spend some time, right, with the Haredi community, right, and they can share example after example of anti-Semitism, not just the brutal, violent, physical anti-Semitism, right? But the subtle anti-Semitism that plays out in their day-to-day life, the hatred of Jews. So it is those two pieces that I think complicate, right, and make it hard for the left to confront and have honest conversations around its own anti-Semitism. The last piece is this, because I know I've been talking a long time. The other place we have to pay attention is around conversations around economic inequality. And that is because of the anti-Semitic trope that Jews control finances, right?
Mm-hmm.
And because of that anti-Semitic trope, it leaves a potential opening, right, for anti-Semitism to raise its head. Western State Center, in short, has been taking on this work for about 3 years. And we have been pulling together cohorts of progressive and liberal leaders who aren't afraid of courageous conversation. And we work with those individuals over a series of time, right, to look at different aspects of anti-Semitism, to understand how it manifests and plays out on the left, right. What are the differences, right? So that because we don't respond to the, right, not everyone who says something anti-Semitic is a Louis Farrakhan or a David Duke, nor do they require the same response we might give to a Farrakhan or Duke, but they do require some kind of response. So we get into the nuances, but at the end of the day, we're trying to strengthen leadership that we think is important towards moving this country to a transparent, people-centered, accountable government that can stand against white nationalist violence, but stand against all forms of anti-bigotry. Can I say one more thing, Nadine, to that very long answer?
Okay, but then I have another
Sum it up.
question.
I'm going to sum all that up in a really simple way. The way to think about this is that the left and right, at the end of the day, we can spend our time pointing fingers at the political left and the political right, but the truth is that these groups don't bring anti-Semitism into our communities. They simply organize the anti-Semitism that already exists. If we are truly honest about wanting to tackle anti-Semitism, right, we don't need to wait until elements of the left or, right, the very volatile racist right appears in our community. There is lots that we can do, right, to help our communities buttress themselves against the specter of anti-Semitism.
Well, I want to talk a little bit about the Black-Jewish relationship, but before we do that, since you brought this up, what can, and briefly, what can we as individuals do? I know there are organizations doing things, but how do we as individuals, talk about how do we combat anti-Semitism in this big way? What do we do? How do we educate people in a way? And I guess it's such a big question, but briefly.
So the first thing I would say is learn, there are a set of standard anti-Semitic tropes. Learn and know them, right? And understand different ways that they manifest. The second is that the next time someone stumbles into one of those anti-Semitic tropes, right? When they make a comment, and it usually comes off as something funny, right? Or like, oh, ha, 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 well, you can pay for that, right? It may be the most subtle thing. You need to not like blast your friend when they say that, right? Or your colleague, but you need to point out exactly what it is, right? You can't assume folks know. The third is you got to practice a little forgiveness, right? The truth is you can't fight anti-Semitism without a willingness to experience it. In the same way that I can't oppose racism without actually experiencing it, right? I have to lean in. So we have to be a little bit nuanced, right, in how we respond to folks. If we shut folks down, right, they never build the memory muscle, right, to kind of lead on this issue. So we have to, so again, learn the tropes, then learn how to speak about them when they happen. Don't let those things slide, right? And then the third is we got to practice a little forgiveness, right? We talk a lot about call out culture, and I talk a lot to the Jewish community. They ask me a lot of questions about call out culture and the excesses of identity politics, right? Those are fair questions, But what I'm going to say here is don't then practice those same tendencies, right?
Absolutely.
Switch the game. People just don't know what anti-Semitism is.
Absolutely. And I used to cover, I was a reporter in Chicago, and I covered the South Side of Chicago, and all the time people there was a lot of ignorance about Jews, a lot of ignorance about anti-Semitism. And I think which leads me to the relationship between Blacks and Jews.
Yes.
And I guess, what do you say to people like DC City Council member Trayon White, who, while we were speaking at a conference in Israel a few years ago, that very day made a comment about the Rothschilds and the weather, I believe, or to football player Deshaun Jackson, who makes kind of anti-Semitic statements and they're basically, on some level, unaware that they're using anti-Semitic tropes because they're embedded in this culture that they live in. What do you say to them? How do you educate them?
Yeah, I wrote an essay about this called Anti-Semitism, the Equal Opportunity Hatred, right? Look, it's I could do a whole hour, 2 hours on this conversation. Here's the first thing I'm going to say. If you are a Black leader or a Black organizer, or a Black activist, I really want you to be good on this topic. And I'll just say this right now, there is a way that I can help you speak to this in a stronger way, right? I hope folks would reach out to me or reach out to Western State Center, right? The second piece I would say is we have to understand as Black folks, right, that we do not get liberated without dealing with anti-Semitism. And anti-Semitism, because it's not just a problem of the white nationalist movement, means we have to contend with it internally. And the reason I say that is twofold. The first is that anti-Semitism denies our own agency as Black people. It says, right, we have no agency on ourselves, that we are just puppets on the strings of this, of this Jewish conspiracy, right? Why would we want to promulgate, right, that kind of narrative, right, that denies us our agency? Anti-Semitism also denies our legitimate grievances, right? When we talk about the disproportionate use of police violence on Black bodies, when we talk about the systems of employment discrimination, housing discrimination, education and its impact on Black folks, when we talk about healthcare systems, what others are being told is that those aren't legitimate conversations, that those are merely being brought up at the instructions, right, of secret Jewish elite. That's why we have to take on anti-Semitism within the Black community. But I want to say one other piece about why we have to take it on. The fact that anti-Semitism moves so easily within Black communities and other marginalized communities, resilient communities that have survived white supremacy, is actually proof of the nature and purpose of anti-Semitism. The purpose of anti-Semitism, right, is to use Jews as a buffer, right, between grievance, right, legitimate grievance, right, and those who can actually address those grievances, right? And what it does is it allows us then to focus our ire on a really small group of people. And as my really amazing, right, mentor, Deborah Lipstadt, often says, you can't blame people with who are left-handed, because we all know folks who are left-handed, right? And if you say left-handed folks are up to a conspiracy, well, I'm thinking I'm left-handed and I don't know anything about this conspiracy. But if you use Jews, who are such a small percentage of the population, people don't know them, right? But we've been unconsciously kind of conditioned through anti-Semitic socialization. Well, it is a way to easily distract us, right, from the real issues. And so what I would say to the city council member, who I know apologized, and I know Deshaun Jackson apologized.
They both did, yes.
Right? David Duke, right? David Duke has never apologized, right? Louis Farrakhan has never really apologized, right? So I want to recognize these folks did try to wrestle with this issue. But what I would say is to also recognize how it distracts. The issue, right, isn't Jews running, the Rothschilds, I think it was in the DC case, having run some secret weather machine, right? The issue is climate change and its impact, right, on Black communities across the United States. I just say, don't let anti-Semitism distract us, but you can't stop it from distracting us if you actually don't know what it is. Okay, one other piece I would just say, because it needs to be said, is we also have to understand the intersectionality of bigotry, right? Just because I am on the receiving end of one form of bigotry doesn't mean that I can't be a perpetrator of another, right? So just because I experience racism doesn't mean that I can't unconsciously or consciously promote anti-Semitism. And there's another layer to this intersection. We also have to be able to admit in our fight to take on anti-Semitism that Black folks, right, who stumble across anti-Semitism are likely to be treated more harshly than their white counterparts. So I think of Deshaun Jackson, and I think the very week, right, he received a lot of ire, let's be clear. Madonna said something equally offensive and didn't get in any trouble. And there was a comedian who also said something, I don't want to say the name wrong just in case I don't want to identify the wrong person, but a very famous comedian. And she also said something anti-Semitic and did not face the wrath. The last piece I'm just going to say is the Trump administration has done nothing but promulgate anti-Semitism over the last 4 years, and very few folks have chosen to hold them to account. I think it's because, in part, that it feels more offensive when something bigoted gets said from another community that suffers from a different form of bigotry. It's more shocking. But the other is that we also have to understand how anti-Blackness may play a role in how we choose to critique individuals and the amount of energy that we put into it. But at the end of the day, look, we have to unstick anti-Semitism because anti-Semitism is a threat to civil rights.
And Jews, of course, some Jews are really concerned about anti-Semitism, but not aware that they're saying things that are racist, and that happens as well. So we do have
That's right.
That. So we're running out of time, but I want to ask 2 more questions. So,
oh yeah.
So
I'll be quick.
I've always been my whole life very, very conscious of the relationship between the Black and Jewish community, which is a long, complex relationship, which I also feel like people do not understand, and we don't educate people about it. So a lot of Jews don't really know about it, and a lot of African Americans in the United States certainly don't know about it. They don't know about the civil NAACP. They don't know about Lillian Wall. They don't know about, just all the different leaders in the group. They don't know about the Civil Rights Partnership, really. How do we re-educate, how do we educate African Americans and Jews and kind of it's not like the partnership is completely tattered, because there's always been, I think, strains where there's always been basically ways in which the communities have worked together on certain levels. But there's certainly this kind of image that it no longer works together. And I guess I'm just wondering, what do we do? What do you think we do?
Yeah. So first, I think, interesting enough, I think we have to do some work in arts and culture, and particularly film. There's lots of films, not a lot, but there's a good chunk of films on the 60s, right? And
1968 gets way too much attention.
1968 is one of the most popular years in film.
Yeah. For this particular topic, it's a terrible year.
That's right. And the way things get portrayed is not terribly nuanced, right? And quite frankly, the relationships between Blacks and Jews are not terribly nuanced. Usually, what I've noticed is in those cases, folks are shown in the most stereotypical ways that you can imagine, right? And I'm just thinking of recent films that come to mind, but I can go back. I think of things more like the pawnbroker, right? If we talk film and culture for a second, right? Film from like the 1960s, Rod Steiger. Well, anyway, Rod Steiger. We won't go into details, but look, it's a hard film to watch, but it's a really nuanced film of a Northern Jewish pawnbroker, right? And the Black community that he is in. He's a Holocaust survivor, right? He's in a community full of poverty. And those tensions, I think, are unpacked in ways that are really powerful. You don't see that very often. Usually it's either, right, the kind of, uneducated Black person who is unable to have any empathy, right, for someone else's history, right? Or it's the Jewish business owner seeking to take advantage. And the relationships were just much more nuanced. So that's one piece. The second is to understand that there are different Black and Jewish histories in America, and they're very complicated. You can't judge them by the moment we stand in. So for instance, right, I'll mess with people's heads, right? Until really the 1920s, right? The early 1900s, 1920s, most Jews in the US are folks we would refer to today as Jews of color, right? And they were much more conservative and supporting of slavery and Jim Crow, right, than their Ashkenazi counterparts who came here as immigrants, right? So let's, so we have to be careful about how we point back to history. There is also a time, right, where white supremacist laws prevented Ashkenazi Jews from fleeing, right, pogroms and the Holocaust to Europe, right? Anne Frank was a victim of that white supremacist, of those pieces of white supremacist policy, right? It tells us that even white people can be racialized, right, in a way that doesn't benefit them. So I think we just need much more nuance. And part of that nuance needs to start in culture, right, in literature, in the arts. And the last thing I'll just say is this. We should not over mythologize the Black-Jewish relationship in the Civil Rights South, but neither should we also over ignore some of the most important pieces, like the far majority, right, of civil rights lawyers in Mississippi in the 1950s and 60s were Jewish, right? I suspect, though I don't know, that Jews were disproportionately present in the civil rights movement. And if you remove Jews from that equation, you would see how few whites actually supported the civil rights movement in the 1960s.
Also,
right?
financial support as well.
Financial support, right? We ignore how critical Jewish and Black populations are to the success of civil rights in this country and equity issues. So there's lots of kind of interesting pieces, right? There's the creation of jazz, there's the creation of hip hop. There's lots of interesting intersections. The truth of the matter is this, and I promised I would keep that short and I totally didn't. Much more to say on that topic, but I'll leave folks with this. I think rather than spending our time talking about the tensions within the Black Jewish community, our focus should be on who benefits from those tensions between the Black and Jewish community from two divided communities in the United States. And I think it's simple as this. When folks get to point to the Jewish community and say, look how anti-Black they are, when they get to point to the Black community and say, look how anti-Semitic it is, it lets the rest of the society off the hook. The society actually has a lot of influence, right, in decision-making power. And so I think we need to focus on the things that have aligned us, right? And to understand that in the North, the relationship between Blacks and Jews was much more akin to new immigrants and Black folks, right? Similar to the tensions between Blacks and Koreans in California, the list goes on, rather than between Blacks and Jews, right? So we have a lot of work to do, but we have a lot of space to do that work if we choose to lean in.
Well, I think there's some things we can work on together here.
Yes.
Because this is really important work to be done. But I wanted to end up with tomorrow is the inauguration of our next president, and a hopeful moment for the country. And I'm wondering, what advice do you have for incoming President Biden?
Yes. So first of all, President Biden, if you ever see this, or if anyone ever says tells you this, first thing I just want to say is thank you, right? President Biden decided to run for office for the president of the United States because of the events of Charlottesville, right? Where folks were chanting, Jews will not replace us, right? Where they circled and tried to attack a group of religious leaders, including very famous Black clergy. The alt-right surrounded them at a monument and attempted to attack them. So first, I just want to say thank President Biden, or I guess President-elect for 24 more hours, for stepping up and leaning in this moment. I would say this. First, to not allow the white nationalist movement to distract you from the things that this country needs to contend with right now. Whether we're talking about COVID-19, right? Whether we're talking about the economic instability that has come from that, right? And reigniting this country's imagination. So the first thing I would just say is do not allow this white nationalist movement to force you into their narrative or to dominate the narrative of the American public, and put all of your resources and energy into ensuring that doesn't happen. The second thing I would say is that it's time to have a full understanding of the impact of white nationalists, right? Inside and outside of our government. And there are a number of experts and organizations around the country who can help do that. The third is please, right? It's easy to just study and research the white nationalist movement, but please, please understand that our communities at the state and local level need resources to be able to compete against the white nationalist movement, right? They are recruiting people based off of urban rural myths, right? Off of the fact that many states' budgets have been gutted because of our inability to finally address segregation that allows white nationalists to take advantage of demographic anxiety. So I would hope that the Biden administration, I know it has a lot on its plate, but I hope that it focuses on those three things. Don't let them steal your narrative, Joe Biden. Please do a full scan and research and a look at the threat of white nationalism in the United States. And three, help local communities respond to hate crimes and the hate violence. We've been out here alone for 4 years, isolated, and we really could use that support.
I know there's so many questions. Maybe we can stand for a couple more minutes. I know we also have other things to do. Suzanne?
Yeah, thank you very much for this very, very powerful presentation. And I know in the chat and in the questions, people are very appreciative of hearing some different viewpoints and some new ideas. So thank you. And as Nadine said, we will definitely need to have you back for a part 2 in the future. So a lot of questions, and I apologize to everyone for not being able to get to many of them. But a question that has come up multiple times has to deal with Black Lives Matter movement. And, the Jewish community has been much more involved in recent months than in past years. But there is still a concern about anti-Semitism that shows up. And some Jews completely will not have anything to do with it, while others do. I think many more do now. But the question becomes is how do you deal with the anti-Semitism, particularly when you are at a march, at a Black Lives Matter march, and you see anti-Semitic rhetoric? How do we deal with that?
Yeah, I think there's some creative ways. So one thing I would just say is, we should first be clear, right? Black Lives Matters is a broad, right, umbrella, right? So you might as well be saying the word pro-democracy, right? You're not talking about, there is a specific organization called Black Lives Matter, but that is a small entity compared to the kind of broadness of Black Lives Matter. So, it's not like you can walk up to the Black Lives Matters headquarters and there is a Black Lives Matters leader who then says, right? So it's not like the Anti-Defamation League, or it's not like Western State Center. So we have to hold that we're talking about a very broad, complex movement that brings a lot of different people into it from a lot of different places in life. I also think it's important to understand, yes, there has to be anti-Semitism there because there is anti-Semitism in society. I think it's more noticeable to us, right? Because it is a racial justice movement. It's probably less noticeable to us than what we see at a New Orleans Mardi Gras festival, right? Or that we see perhaps, or, we probably expect it in a white nationalist movement. But it's not so broad. I think it's just more shocking. So I think there's a few things that we have to do. The first is look, you don't have to join with Black Lives Matter, but I'll tell you something. You're missing the birth of the 21st century civil rights movement. And when your kids ask you where you were, right? I hope that the answer you give is satisfying to them, right? And to yourself. I think you're really missing something. The Black Lives Matters movement is the largest civil rights movement to ever exist. And if you remove yourself from that movement, you are removing your influence and impact from that movement. So what do you do for those of us who are there and lean in? Well, the first is that we have to point out anti-Semitism when it happens, right? We have to understand, again, not everyone recognizes it. We have to point it out, and we have to ask for the movement to limit the space, right, for anti-Semitism. If you're at a march, one of the creative things that I've seen, and it doesn't just involve folks dealing with anti-Semitism, but a host of other, like misogyny, right? We've seen very misogynistic flyers or posters folks have put up in their excitement to be part of Black Lives Matter. And so folks have been creating double signs, right? So they have like their main message on the front, and then on the back, it's a message like no room for other forms of bigotry. And when they see something misogynistic or anti-Semitic or anti-immigrant, they actually flip those signs around, right? And they actually kind of follow the person with the sign. First they talk to them, ask them if they're willing to take it down. And if not, then they are a witness, right, to that sign. They're not crowding the person. They're not yelling at the person. They're just being witnesses, right? And pointing out like there's no room for bigotry. So there are creative ways to do that. Let's also be clear, right? Increasingly, I can tell you, going back to the Deshaun Jackson, I can tell you I am watching way more Black Lives Matters leaders speak out around anti-Semitism than I have ever seen in social movements across the board, right, over the last couple of years. So for those of you who are leaning in, I just want to say you're having an impact. And the folks who are having the most impact are Jews of color, particularly Black Jews, who are carrying the burdens of anti-Semitism, right, and anti-Black racism in both communities, right? And it's not their burden and it's not their responsibility, but it is what they have had to do. And I think that grouping in both of our communities are deserving of our support, right? And of respect right now. But again, you can't do anything about it, right, if you're just standing back. And if you're only attacking anti-Semitism on the left because you don't like leftists, you're not helping those of us who are actually trying to deal with anti-Semitism, right? And I say that to folks on the left who only point out anti-Semitism as a foil against Republicans, right? The folks who are using it as partisan attacks are not helping us. They're not helping the Jewish community. They're not helping the rest of us. So we got to lean in. We got to contest these spaces, right? When Black folks showed up at labor movements in the 1920s and 30s, I can guarantee you that labor leaders did not open up the doors and throw their arms around and say, "Oh my God, how did we miss racism?" as part of the labor movement. When the LGBTQ community showed up in the 80s and 90s, right, to the doors of the civil rights movement, you know, I'd love to tell you the civil rights movement was like, of course, how did we miss this? That's not the case, right? Folks primarily responded by saying, "What are you doing here? You're distracting us. This is not the issue." What is happening to the Jewish community as it starts to kind of advance this conversation on anti-Semitism is the same thing, but keep leaning in, keep pushing. It is having an effect. It's actually having a pretty significant effect, in my opinion, and positive.
Thank you. I want to be respectful of time. We're pretty much out of time, but if you have just a couple more minutes, if I can get to maybe 2 more questions, that would be great for folks who could stay with us. A question several people have had have been related to the BDS movement, in particular on college campuses, and students Jewish students having to deal with all of the anti-Israel rhetoric and kind of not knowing where to go. And do you have any advice for that?
Yeah. So one of the things that I think is really important, right, is I'm not a person who says, "Oh, no Jewish students have been attacked or harassed on campus around Israel." It's just not true. I've now heard enough stories, and I've witnessed a couple of events that happen where we know, like, increasingly, right, there is a conversation around and a debate around Israel and the Palestinian territories and Palestine. I think here's my take. What would benefit students, whether they're Jewish or not Jewish, is actually a joined, deepening understanding around both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, right? And the reason why is I think it would deepen how people responded and understood. That's hard to do in the midst of a debate, right, on Middle East politics. It's too charged. And so universities have to find ways, right, of having spaces that aren't charged. And I don't know if those are special seminars, right? I don't know if those are other kind of joint projects on kind of dealing with hate crimes, right? But there has to be another space that's created. Otherwise, it's very hard for folks to untwine, right, their feelings around human rights, right, their feelings around sovereignty, right, and these two forms of bigotry that often kind of make those conversations even harder than they already are. At the end of the day, though, right, all students have a right to be on campus and not be harassed, right? And so anti-harassment policies are critically important, right? That's not how these issues get solved. It's not how we identify problems and solutions. So we have to inch forward. I understand it's a controversial issue. I'm not an expert on Middle East politics, right? So that's not my area of expertise, right? But I would say, if I were comparing it to other hot button issues that are debated in progressive and left spaces, what I understand is that often repositioning those conversations on another terrain helps deepen students' understanding, right? There needs to be healthy debate, right? Don't get me wrong. I don't think we should be trying to cut off debate. I don't think we should be cutting off people having very varied opinions. But our job is to deepen and nuance those conversations as much as possible. That really calls for the leadership of administrators and faculty.
Great, thank you. And then I will end with going back to the conversation about white nationalists.
Yes.
How would you explain how the alt-right and other white nationalists who are Trump supporters have ignored the fact that he has a daughter and son-in-law who are Jewish. And then I'll add with this, I know you have written about your experience attending a white nationalist conference, and what sticks out in your mind. What was the biggest thing that you took away from being there?
Okay. So, you know, the alt-right is, so not everyone in the alt-right is a hardcore anti-Semite or even a conscious anti-Semite. So that's important to remember. Folks join movements for all kinds of reasons, but at the core of the alt-right, this coalition lies white nationalism. And white nationalism is anti-Semitic. It is written on the paper of anti-Semitism. Now, how that manifests itself in different ways is critically important to understand. And one of the ways that anti-Semitism manifests itself is through something known as philo-Semitism, which is a form of anti-Semitism under the guise of celebrating. And I'll give you a counterexample that'll make it very easy. It's like folks who point at Black people and say, oh my God, you are amazing athletes, or you dance so well, right? These are attempts, right, to put positive connotations to what are actually really racist and anti-Black statements. In the same way, philo-Semitism does the same thing. It purports to kind of place Jews in a positive role, but in fact is still caricaturizing them, right, and putting them in a very limited stereotypical box. That is what has happened with Ivanka, right, and Jared and other, and quite frankly, even folks outside of his family like Steve Miller. For much of the alt-right, right, they have tied themselves to a distorted understanding of Zionism, right? One that fits their needs, that results, right, in the, let's be clear what it results in. It is the belief that Jews will ultimately convert to Christianity, right, and that the end of the world gets set off by a nuclear war in Israel, right? And you may laugh about their intentions around that, but folks used to laugh at me about the idea that the white nationalist movement would ever be a threat in the United States. So there's that, right? What I would say is that we have to understand that philo-Semitism exists. And two, that people build very strange coalitions all of the time. Political coalitions have folks in it who would never work with one another under different conditions, and therein lies that. The last piece I would say about what I've learned about the white nationalist movement is that from attending meetings, and I attended more than one meeting in my time, is this. The first is it functions as a social movement just like every other social movement. It just has different goals and different tools that it's willing to use, violence, right, and exclusion. But like every other social movement in America, it can have impact and great impact. The last thing I learned is most white nationalists are not monsters hiding under our bed or in our closet, right? They are folks we go to school with, right? They're folks we work with, right? They're not monsters. And so we have to approach it in a way that is merely not about the criminalization of white nationalists, right? We have to be cautious about not setting up laws and systems that believe that we can deal with white nationalism just by making everyone a criminal. It will backfire. I will tell you this right now. You can, folks can, this is the moment where I tell folks you can roll your eyes, right? But we will be right back here again in 10 years if you don't heed this advice, which is you cannot criminalize this out of existence. You have to compete for the hearts and minds of the constituencies that they are trying to recruit. And that means making sure organizations that can compete, right, are well resourced and supported to do just that. At the end of the day, we are dealing with folks who are trying to find meaning in American society. And the first folks to try to give them meaning are folks who seek to destroy them, the white nationalist movement. In truth, the civil rights movement in this country has delivered more tangibly for white America, right, than the white nationalist movement ever has or ever will. It's time to make our case around what is America and who is America. And our list is just much more expansive. For instance, it even includes white nationalists, and they can't say the same.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nadine.
There's so
Thank
much
you all.
We'll say it another time, but thank you very much.
I look forward, and I appreciate you all, and I hope everyone is a subscriber to the magazine.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Eric. This was really so powerful. And as I said before, we're getting so many comments about thanking you for new ways of looking at this, and also for your ideas of how people can step up. I want to remind everybody to please go to our website, where you will find lots of articles, and also you can register for next week's Zoominar, North Africa's Forgotten Holocaust. We will be sending out a follow-up email where we will include some of the various movies and links and articles that Eric suggested. I know a lot of people have asked. His organization that he's the executive director of is the Western State Center, and I will send the link to that as well. Also, finally, if you have enjoyed today's session, learned a lot, we would really appreciate it if you were on our website and decided to make a donation to help us support the ongoing work that we do at MOMIC, and to provide opportunities like this to you in the future. Again, thank you, Nadine. Thank you, Eric. Good night, everybody, and we'll see you next time.